October 25, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. 0658 hours. A wall of fire erupts across the Pacific horizon as the Imperial Japanese Navy's super battleship Yamato unleashes hell itself. Her 18-inch guns, each barrel weighing as much as a freight locomotive, spit shells the size of Volkswagen Beetles through the morning fog at 40,000 yards. The ocean explodes. Columns of seawater shoot 300 feet into the sky, dyed blood red and electric yellow by Japanese marker dye. And standing directly in the path of this apocalyptic barrage is a thin line of American destroyers, each one smaller than Yamato's forward turret alone. One direct hit will split any of them clean in half. And yet in the next 90 minutes, these tiny 2,000-ton warships will do something so insane that Japanese admirals will refuse to believe their own after-action reports. They will charge directly at 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 13 other warships. They will fire torpedoes at point-blank range, and they will win. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the forgotten stories of history. Join our community as we uncover more untold battles, unsung heroes, and moments that changed the world forever. This is the story of Commander William Austin Gibbs, a quiet naval engineer from a small town in Virginia who nobody remembers, and the 175 warships he built that made the largest battleship in human history irrelevant. His idea was called ridiculous. His design was called bloated. Senior admirals laughed at him in closed meetings. And then his ships saved 200,000 American lives in a single morning off the coast of Samar. To understand how a handful of destroyers ended up turning back the most powerful surface fleet Japan ever assembled, we have to go back 3 years to a time when America was losing the Pacific so badly that some admirals privately wondered if the war could ever be won. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. When Japanese aircraft finished their devastating 2-wave attack on Battleship Row, the United States Pacific Fleet was essentially destroyed. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. Over 2,400 Americans killed. 1,178 wounded. In a single morning, Japan erased the backbone of American naval power. And that was only the beginning. Within weeks, Imperial forces seized Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and the Philippines. The British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse were sent to the bottom by Japanese aircraft off Malaya, proving that even the mighty Royal Navy was not safe. By March 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, larger than anything Napoleon or Hitler had ever conquered. But the real disaster wasn't the loss of ships, it was the loss of doctrine. For 20 years, the U.S. Navy had built its entire Pacific strategy around the battleship. Huge armored dreadnoughts would steam across the ocean in a grand fleet, meet the Japanese somewhere near the Philippines, and win the war in a single afternoon of thunderous gunfire. That was Plan Orange. Pearl Harbor didn't just sink ships, it sank the entire plan. And worse, American destroyers, the small fast ships that were supposed to support the battleships, were hopelessly outclassed. The old Farragut-class and Mahan-class boats that survived Pearl Harbor carried only 8 torpedoes each. The Benson-class, built in 1940, carried just 5. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers were armed with the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, a weapon with a range of 22 miles, a warhead of over 1,000 pounds, and a wakeless oxygen propulsion system that left almost no trace in the water. A single Japanese Fubuki-class destroyer carried 9 Long Lance torpedoes, plus 9 reloads, 18 torpedoes per ship. At Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese destroyers using these weapons sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers in less than an hour, the worst naval defeat in American history since 1812. Everything was collapsing. But everything was about to change because of a man nobody was paying attention to. His name was Commander William Austin Gibbs, not the famous naval architect William Francis Gibbs, who designed the SS United States. This was the other Gibbs, a career officer from a small Virginia town, who had spent 15 years buried in the bureaucratic maze of the Bureau of Ships. He did not command warships. He did not give fiery speeches. He was a quiet, methodical, stubborn engineer who examined destroyer design the way a watchmaker examines gears. He knew every rivet, every weld, every stress calculation of every American destroyer class built since the Great War. His office was cramped. His uniform was always slightly rumpled. He worked late into the night, drinking cold coffee and filling notebook after notebook with calculations in his careful handwriting. The combat officers who passed through the bureau barely noticed him. They called him the bookkeeper behind his back. And yet, by early 1940, almost 2 full years before Pearl Harbor, this overlooked man had reached a conclusion that would terrify the entire senior leadership of the United States Navy. He had realized that the Navy was building its destroyers wrong, completely wrong, catastrophically wrong. And if war came before the design changed, thousands of American sailors were going to die for nothing. And then came the defining moment. One rainy night in March 1940, Gibbs was working alone in the bureau when a classified intelligence report landed on his desk. It was a translated Japanese technical document obtained through back channels describing the Type 93 torpedo. Gibbs read the specifications twice, then a third time. Then he sat very still, staring at the wall for almost an hour. His wife Helen later recalled that he came home at 3 in the morning, sat at the kitchen table, and told her without any emotion at all that America was going to lose every night battle it fought in the Pacific unless someone built a completely new kind of destroyer. She asked him who was going to do that. He said, "I am." Also, the idea Gibbs proposed was so radical, it made admirals physically angry. He wanted to build a destroyer bigger than anything the Navy had ever attempted. Not a light cruiser pretending to be a destroyer, but a true fleet destroyer, massive enough to carry heavy torpedo armament without sacrificing gun speed or range. He demanded 10 torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, centerline mounted so they could fire to either side. He demanded 5 5-inch guns in single enclosed mounts, the most powerful gun armament ever fitted to an American destroyer. He demanded 36.5 knots from 60,000 horsepower. He demanded a range of 6,000 nautical miles, enough to cross the Pacific without refueling. And all of it would push the ship to 2,100 tons standard displacement, shattering every treaty limit that had governed destroyer design for a generation. Think of it like this. Every previous destroyer was a sports car fast light carrying a single weapon system. Gibbs wanted to build a pickup truck loaded with rocket launchers, missile batteries, and still fast enough to outrun the sports cars. It sounded impossible. The General Board, the Navy's senior advisory body on ship design, went ballistic. They called the proposal bloated, wasteful. One admiral reportedly slammed his hand on the table and shouted that putting 10 torpedoes on a destroyer was like giving an infantryman 2 rifles. Theoretically, more firepower, practically ridiculous. Another member of the board called the design suicidal, arguing that a ship that large would be an easy target. Gibbs was told to go back to his drafting table and design something reasonable. Instead, he went home, sat down with Helen, and told her he was going to fight them, every single one of them. What happened next is the part nobody talks about. Gibbs refused to stop. For months, working nights and weekends in his cramped Washington office, he ran calculations over and over. He proved that in a night surface engagement, the difference between 5 torpedoes and 10 torpedoes was not simply twice the firepower. It was an exponential increase in hit probability. With 5 torpedoes fired in a spread at a maneuvering target at 8,000 yards, the odds of scoring at least one hit were roughly 28%. With 10 torpedoes fired in a properly calculated spread, those odds jumped to over 52%. In the chaos of a night battle, where you might only get one chance to fire before the enemy returned fire, that difference was the line between victory and annihilation. He recruited a small team of junior officers and civilian engineers who shared his vision. They worked in secret skipping meals, calling in favors, running structural tests that proved the larger hull could actually be stronger than smaller predecessors, because the additional length distributed stress loads more efficiently. They designed a new ammunition handling system that could sustain 15 rounds per minute from the 5-inch guns, faster than any destroyer mount in the world. They solved the twin quintuple torpedo mount problem with a single centralized torpedo workshop amidships, and they kept going even when their supervisor warned them privately that Gibbs was making powerful enemies who would destroy his career. Gibbs did not care. He had seen the numbers. He knew what was coming. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1940 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard on a hot July afternoon that nobody expected to matter. Gibbs had arranged a private demonstration for Rear Admiral Samuel Robinson, the chief of the Bureau of Ships. Using a full-scale wooden mock-up of the proposed torpedo mount arrangement, Gibbs showed Robinson exactly how a well-drilled crew could train both quintuple mounts to a firing bearing, set up a 10-torpedo spread, and launch every weapon in under 45 seconds. The first demonstration took 43 seconds. Robinson said nothing. His face was completely blank. He asked Gibbs to do it again. The second demonstration took 41 seconds. Robinson folded his arms, asked for it a third time. 39 seconds. The mock torpedoes slid cleanly out of their tubes in a perfect fan pattern. Robinson stood motionless for a long moment, then turned to his aide and spoke 4 words that changed American naval history forever. "Build me this ship." Within days, approval orders were moving through the Bureau. Within weeks, the design was being translated into engineering specifications. And on October 2, 1941, exactly 2 months and 5 days before Pearl Harbor, the lead ship of the new class was laid down at Federal Shipbuilding in Kearny, New Jersey. Hull number D-445, the USS Fletcher. She was 376 feet long, 39 feet in beam, displacing 2,050 tons standard. She was the largest, most heavily armed fleet destroyer the United States had ever built. And the Navy did not build just one of her. They built 175. The largest class of destroyer in naval history. A production achievement so staggering that Japanese intelligence, when they finally learned the numbers, refused to believe them. The first Fletchers entered service in mid-1942, just in time for the desperate nighttime brawls around Guadalcanal. And their impact was immediate. On the night of August 6, 1943, 6 Fletcher-Class destroyers under Commander Frederick Moosbrugger set a trap in the dark waters of Vela Gulf. Japanese intelligence had detected 4 Japanese destroyers attempting a supply run down the slot. Moosbrugger arranged his ships in 2 divisions and waited. When the Japanese ships appeared on radar at 23,000 yards, the Americans did something the Japanese had never seen before. They launched a coordinated torpedo attack using their massive quintuple mounts, sending a spread of 24 torpedoes racing through the dark water at 45 knots. The Japanese lookouts saw nothing. The long lance had taught them to look for the familiar wakes of American torpedoes, but these Mark 15 fired from a far greater distance than they expected, arrived almost without warning. 3 Japanese destroyers, the Hagakaze Arashi and Kawakaze, exploded almost simultaneously. All 3 sank within minutes. The 4th Shigur escaped into the darkness. Her captain so stunned that his after-action report simply said the sea had erupted. Not a single American ship was hit. Not a single American sailor was killed. 3 enemy warships destroyed for 0 losses. In the bloody Solomon Islands campaign, where American and Japanese forces had been trading ships almost 1 for 1, a result like this was unheard of. Japanese commanders were thunderstruck. Post-war interrogations would later reveal that Vela Gulf sent shockwaves through the Imperial Japanese Navy's destroyer command. For 2 years they had assumed their long lance torpedoes and superior night fighting training gave them an insurmountable advantage. Vela Gulf proved that assumption was dead wrong. The Fletcher class, with its 10-torpedo broadside and advanced fire control radar, had leveled the playing field overnight. But Vela Gulf was just the opening act. For the next 14 months, Fletcher-class destroyers fought across the Pacific, hammering Japanese supply lines at Kolombangara, screening the fast carriers at the Marianas, bombarding shores from Tarawa to Saipan. Every engagement confirmed what Gibbs had promised. The 10-torpedo salvo was not just firepower, it was psychological terror. Japanese commanders, knowing American destroyers could unleash that kind of spread, began maneuvering defensively, even when no torpedoes had been fired. The Fletcher-class was rewriting the rules of surface warfare without any one person fully realizing it. And somewhere in Washington, Commander William Austin Gibbs was reading the after-action reports late at night in his cramped office, saying nothing, showing nothing, but knowing that every admiral who had called his design ridiculous was now quietly, desperately asking the Bureau of Ships to build more of them. Faster. You might think at this point that the Fletcher-class story is simply a tale of American engineering triumph. Better ship, better weapons, better results. But here is where everything gets complicated. Because the greatest moment in Fletcher-class history did not come from superior technology. It came from a situation where technology did not matter at all. It came from a moment where the only thing standing between total catastrophe and survival was raw, suicidal human courage and a design choice that one stubborn engineer had fought for years to preserve. In Part 2, we will witness what happened when a handful of Fletcher-class destroyers, low on fuel, low on ammunition, completely outgunned, and facing the most powerful Japanese surface fleet since Midway, received an order so desperate that their captains knew it was a death sentence. We will see how Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee from Oklahoma, turned his destroyer, USS Johnston, directly toward the super battleship Yamato and gave the command to attack. We will see how 10 torpedoes per ship transformed from a tactical advantage into the only thing keeping 200,000 American soldiers alive on the Leyte beaches. We will meet the destroyer captains who knew exactly what was about to happen to them and gave the order to charge anyway. And we will discover why Admiral Kurita, standing on the bridge of the largest battleship ever built, made a decision that Japanese officers would argue about for the next 80 years. The battle off Samar was coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. In Part 1, we met Commander William Austin Gibbs, the quiet Virginia engineer who fought the United States Navy's own bureaucracy to build a destroyer carrying 10 torpedoes per ship. Rear Admiral Samuel Robinson watched the Philadelphia demonstration and said 4 words that launched the Fletcher-class. "Build me this ship." But getting one admiral to say yes was not the same as winning the war inside the Navy. Because in the summer of 1941, Gibbs was about to discover that approval on paper meant nothing. The General Board still hated his design. Budget committees still called it bloated. And senior admirals who had opposed him were already plotting to kill the program before a single hull touched the water. Japan was tearing through the Pacific. American sailors were dying at a rate of 200 per week. And here is where everything got worse. But the man leading the opposition was Vice Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, the most powerful uniformed officer in the United States Navy. Stark had spent his entire career believing in the battleship. He had written papers arguing that destroyers should be small, cheap, and expendable, built in huge numbers to screen the capital ships that would actually win the war. Gibbs's Fletcher-class design offended everything Stark believed. A 100-ton destroyer was not expendable. It was expensive. Each Fletcher would cost roughly $11 million in 1941 money, nearly double the price of the older Benson class. Stark did the math. For the cost of 175 Fletchers, the Navy could build 340 smaller destroyers, twice as many hulls, twice as much coverage. His position was logical, experienced, and institutionally powerful. And he was wrong in a way that would get thousands of sailors killed. The first confrontation happened in a wood-paneled conference room in the main Navy building on July 18, 1941. Gibbs was summoned to defend his specifications in front of a panel of 7 senior officers. Stark was not present, but his deputies were. According to a stenographer's notes later declassified in the 1990s, the meeting lasted almost 4 hours. One captain pointed at Gibbs's blueprints and said, quote, You're asking the Navy to bet 175 ships on a torpedo system that hasn't been tested in combat. If you're wrong, we lose the Pacific, Gibbs replied quietly. If I'm right and we don't build them, we lose the Pacific anyway. The room went silent. Another officer accused Gibbs of basing his calculations on, quote, theoretical engagements that will never happen. Gibbs opened a folder and distributed 16 pages of intelligence reports on the Japanese long-lance torpedo. He said, "These engagements are already happening. We just haven't fought them yet." The panel voted 5-2 to recommend reducing the torpedo armament from 10 tubes to 5. Gibbs walked out knowing his career might be over. 2 weeks later, he received official orders transferring him out of the destroyer design section to a desk job managing harbor craft procurement. It was a demotion in everything but title. His supervisor pulled him aside and told him quietly that Stark's office had personally requested the reassignment. Gibbs went home that night and told Helen he was finished. She told him, "Not yet, you aren't." But he knew. He knew that by the time the transfer processed, the General Board would quietly revise the Fletcher specifications, strip out the second torpedo mount, and turn his design into just another compromise. The war would come, men would die, and nobody would remember why. Then, on the morning of July 25, 1941, Gibbs found an unexpected ally waiting in his office. The visitor was Rear Admiral Ernest Joseph King, one of the most feared officers in the United States Navy. King had a reputation for being cold, profane, and absolutely intolerant of bureaucratic nonsense. He had read Gibbs's design memo on a transatlantic flight and wanted answers. King sat down without taking off his coat. He said, "Commander, I have exactly 15 minutes. Convince me." Gibbs took 8 of those minutes. He laid out the hit probability numbers. He explained the long-lance threat. He showed King the structural analysis, proving the larger hull would be stronger, not weaker. King listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. "Can you prove this in combat?" Gibbs said yes. King stood up, walked to the door, and turned back. His final words to Gibbs that morning would become one of the most quietly consequential sentences in Navy history. He said, "Then I'll make sure you get the chance." 3 weeks later, Stark's transfer order was mysteriously rescinded. Gibbs was restored to the destroyer design section, and the first Fletcher-class hulls began taking shape at Federal Shipbuilding. But King had demanded a price. Combat proof. Real, undeniable combat proof fast. Gibbs needed the first Fletchers in the water in the Pacific and engaged with Japanese warships before Stark's allies in Congress could cut the funding. The timeline was brutal. The lead ship USS Fletcher was commissioned on June 30, 1942. By November 4, Fletchers were fighting at Guadalcanal, crews half-trained radar systems still experimental. They scored hits, absorbed hits, and survived. But King wanted something cleaner, something undeniable. He wanted a set-piece demonstration that nobody could argue with. He got it on the night of August 6, 1943. The official combat test of everything Gibbs had designed. It came in a narrow stretch of dark water called Vela Gulf, and it would rewrite naval tactics forever. Mates. The commander was Frederick Moosbrugger, a 43-year-old career destroyer officer who had studied Gibbs's design philosophy in detail. He had 6 Fletcher-class destroyers under his flag, and he had spent 3 weeks drilling his captains on a revolutionary tactic. They would not engage with guns first. They would launch torpedoes at maximum range in total darkness and withdraw before the Japanese even knew they were under attack. Every previous American destroyer engagement had opened with gunfire. Gunfire gave away position. Gunfire let Japanese destroyers maneuver and counterfire with their own long lances. Moosbrugger's plan was silent. First guns only after torpedoes struck. It was radical. It required absolute fire discipline, and it depended entirely on whether the Fletcher's 10-torpedo broadside could actually deliver what Gibbs had promised on paper. The night was pitch black, new moon, no stars visible through the tropical overcast. At 23:34 hours, radar contact was made at 19,700 yards. 4 Japanese destroyers. Hagikaze, Arashi Kawakaze, and Shigure running a supply mission down the slot at 30 knots. The Japanese had no idea they had been detected. Their own radar was primitive. Their lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars. Nothing. Moosbrugger ordered his first division of 3 Fletchers to close to 10,000 yards. At 23:41, he gave the order. Fire. 24 torpedoes left their tubes in 43 seconds. The ships immediately turned away into the darkness, their engines making no more noise than necessary, presenting the smallest possible radar silhouette. For 4 minutes, nothing happened. The Japanese column kept steaming forward, oblivious. On the American bridges, officers counted down the torpedo run times on stopwatches. Gibbs had calculated 4 minutes 30 seconds to target. At 4 minutes 27 seconds, the horizon erupted. Hagikaze took a torpedo amidships and split open like a fruit. Her boilers exploded 4 seconds later, lifting the aft half of the ship clear out of the water before it slammed back down and slid under. Arashi was hit by 2 torpedoes, almost simultaneously, one forward, one aft, and she broke into 3 pieces. Kawakaze caught a torpedo in her forward magazine and simply vaporized. A 2,000-ton destroyer gone in a single white flash that lit up the sea for miles. Only Shigure, trailing the column by 800 yards, had time to turn hard and comb the wakes of the remaining torpedoes. Her captain later wrote in his log that the sea had erupted without warning, as if God himself had opened the ocean. 3 Japanese destroyers destroyed. Roughly 1,210 Japanese sailors killed. 0 American ships hit. 0 American casualties. The entire engagement lasted 18 minutes from radar contact to disengagement. Moosbrugger's report reached King's desk 6 days later. King read it twice, then personally hand-carried it to the Oval Office. The next morning, production orders for the Fletcher-class were accelerated by 40%. Every shipyard on the East and Gulf coasts was ordered to prioritize DD-4-45 class hulls. Budget objections evaporated. Congressional critics went silent. Admiral Stark's faction inside the General Board lost every subsequent argument about destroyer design for the rest of the war. The official test had been passed in blood and fire exactly as Gibbs had promised 3 years earlier. But proving the design worked in one ambush was one thing. Fighting a world war with it was something else entirely. Within 8 months, 67 Fletcher-class destroyers were commissioned and deployed. Shipyards were launching new hulls at a rate of 1 every 4.5 days at the peak of production. Training programs at Newport and San Diego processed 500 new destroyer sailors per week. The logistical strain was enormous. Experienced chief petty officers were pulled from older destroyers to serve as cadre for new Fletcher crews, creating manpower gaps across the fleet. Some older destroyer captains openly resented the attention the new ships received. They called the Fletchers golden children and complained that Washington was playing favorites. Gibbs spent much of 1943 traveling to forward bases, conducting training sessions on torpedo spread calculations and damage control techniques. He slept on transport planes. He ate rations. He argued with frustrated captains who didn't trust the new fire control systems. And slowly, grudgingly, the fleet accepted what Vela Gulf had proven. Japanese intelligence, meanwhile, was in crisis. Captured documents later revealed that Tokyo initially refused to believe 6 destroyers had destroyed 3 without loss. They suspected American submarines or aircraft. When the truth emerged, Japanese destroyer doctrine was rewritten in a panic. New tactics, new formations, new orders to avoid night engagements with American forces whenever possible. The hunters had become the hunted. By October 1944, over 100 Fletcher-class destroyers were operating in the Pacific. They screened fast carrier groups. They escorted amphibious assaults. They hunted submarines from the Aleutians to Australia. And a specific group of them, 13 small escort carriers, protected by 3 Fletcher destroyers, and 4 smaller destroyer escorts had been formed into a force with the innocent-sounding designation Task Unit 77.4.3. The sailors called it Taffy 3. It was the northernmost of three escort carrier groups supporting the invasion of the Philippines. It was lightly armed. It was never intended to fight surface warships, and on the morning of October 25, 1944, Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, chasing a decoy force to the north, would leave the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Through that open door, 23 Japanese warships were about to pour, led by the largest battleship ever built. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, enough firepower to level a city. Heading directly at Taffy 3. And behind Taffy 3, 200,000 American soldiers on the Leyte beaches. In Part 3, Commander Ernest Evans would give an order that no American destroyer captain had ever given before. And 10 torpedoes per ship would become the only thing standing between the United States and the worst naval disaster of the Pacific War. In Parts 1 and 2, we watched Commander William Austin Gibbs fight the Navy's own bureaucracy to build a destroyer carrying 10 torpedoes, and we saw 6 Fletcher-Class warships annihilate 3 Japanese destroyers at Vela Gulf without a single American casualty. Japanese intelligence panicked. Tokyo rewrote its destroyer doctrine overnight. But all of that was prologue. Because on the morning of October 25, 1944, 23 Japanese warships, led by the largest battleship ever built, were steaming through an unguarded strait toward 13 American escort carriers, protected only by a thin screen of Fletcher destroyers. The Japanese would fire 18-inch shells the size of small cars. The Americans would fire back with 5-inch guns, and the only weapon Gibbs had promised would save them. 10 torpedoes per ship. And this was not a test anymore. This was the moment the entire Pacific War would hinge on. And what happened in the next 150 minutes would leave Japanese admirals completely speechless. The Japanese flagship Yamato opened fire at 6:58 hours from 39,000 yards. Her first salvo of 9 18-inch shells screamed through the morning air and smashed into the sea around the escort carrier, USS White Plains, throwing columns of dyed seawater 300 feet into the sky. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, standing on Yamato's bridge, expected to see American fleet carriers, fast battleships, and heavy cruisers burning within minutes. What he actually saw made no sense to him. His optical rangefinders showed small, low-slow ships, destroyers, and escort carriers. He stared through his binoculars and kept asking his staff for confirmation. Where was Halsey? Where was the Third Fleet? Japanese naval intelligence had spent weeks preparing for this moment, calculating gunnery solutions against American heavy units. None of those calculations applied to what Kurita was actually looking at. His chief of staff, Captain Tomiji Koyanagi, later admitted that Kurita's first reaction was suspicion. This had to be a trap. No American commander would leave escort carriers completely exposed. The entire Japanese formation slowed by 4 knots as Kurita tried to make sense of the picture. And here, the Japanese reaction became truly devastating to their own cause. Kurita ordered general attack, meaning each Japanese ship would engage the enemy independently rather than in coordinated formation. In theory, this would let his faster cruisers catch the escort carriers, while his battleships dealt with the destroyers. In practice, it destroyed Japanese tactical cohesion. The heavy cruiser Chokai surged ahead at 32 knots. Haguro and Tony raced forward on a different heading. Yamato and Nagato lumbered behind at 27 knots. Within 20 minutes, what had been a disciplined battle line became a confused scrum of individual ships chasing individual targets. Japanese gunnery officers later told American interrogators that they could not concentrate fire because the target data kept changing. Their fire control radar was primitive compared to American systems. Their shells fused for penetrating battleship armor, passed clean through the thin destroyer hulls without exploding. 3 Japanese cruisers would later report armor-piercing shell hits on American destroyers that produced almost no damage because the shells went in one side and out the other before detonating. The very power of Japanese guns became a liability against unarmored targets. And meanwhile, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague was making the only decision left to him. Sprague had no illusions. He later recalled that when he saw the pagoda masts of Japanese battleships appearing on his horizon, he estimated Taffy 3 would be annihilated within 45 minutes. He ordered his escort carriers to flee east at their maximum 17.5 knots, launching every aircraft with any weapon it could carry, even bombs meant for ground support. Then he gave the order that would define the Fletcher-class forever. He ordered his 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts to attack. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers against 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. The tonnage ratio was roughly 26-1 against the Americans. The firepower ratio was worse. Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston did not wait for the order to reach him formally. By 7:10, Johnston was already charging toward the Japanese fleet. At 35 knots, her boilers pushed past safe operating limits. Evans picked up the ship's intercom, and his voice came through every compartment. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Nobody got off. Johnston disappeared into a self-made smokescreen and emerged 12,000 yards from the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. And this was where Gibbs's design would face its ultimate test. At 7:20, Johnston opened fire with her 5 5-inch guns, pumping over 200 shells into Kumano's superstructure in less than 10 minutes. The shells could not penetrate Kumano's belt armor, but they shredded her bridge, knocked out her fire control directors, and killed dozens of exposed gun crews. Evans kept closing. At 10,000 yards, he gave the command every Fletcher captain had trained for: fire torpedoes. All 10 Mark 15 torpedoes left Johnston's tubes in 47 seconds, fanning out in the precise spread pattern Gibbs had calculated years earlier in his Washington office. The torpedoes ran for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Then, Kumano's bow exploded. A torpedo struck her forward of her anchor chain locker and ripped the entire forward 40 feet of the ship clean off. Kumano staggered to a halt, flooding uncontrollably, her forward guns pointing uselessly at the sky. A 13,000-ton heavy cruiser crippled by a 2,100-ton destroyer. But Johnston did not escape. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo and a 6-inch shell from the light cruiser Yahagi smashed into her engine room and bridge at 7:30. Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand. He wrapped the wounds in a torn khaki shirt. He refused to leave the bridge. Johnston kept fighting with 1 engine, half her guns, and no radar. Men behind Johnston, USS Howell charged the battleship line directly. Commander Leon Kintberger fired 5 torpedoes at the battleship Congo from 9,000 yards, forcing the 37,000-ton battleship to turn hard to evade disrupting her firing solutions for nearly 6 minutes. Then Howell fired her remaining 5 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Haguro. Every torpedo in the water forced a Japanese capital ship to maneuver, and maneuvering meant they could not shoot accurately. Howell absorbed over 40 shell hits. Her engine rooms flooded. Her gun mounts failed one by one. She sank at 08:55, taking 253 of her crew with her. USS Herman, the 3rd Fletcher, made the most insane run of all. She charged between the Japanese battleships and the fleeing carriers, firing torpedoes at Haruna, and then turning her 5-inch guns on the cruiser column. At one point, Herman passed within 4,400 yards of Yamato, and the super battleship's 18-inch guns could not depress low enough to hit her. Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was forced to turn away from a destroyer to avoid torpedoes. The turn took Yamato out of the battle for almost 10 minutes. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, displacing only 1,350 tons, fired her 3 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Chokai from 4,000 yards. When her 5-inch ammunition ran low, her gunners loaded star shells, illumination rounds not designed to damage anything, and fired them at a heavy cruiser because it was all they had left. Roberts was overwhelmed and sank at 10:05. But her torpedoes contributed to a fatal hit on Chokai. Within 150 minutes, 3 Japanese heavy cruisers had been sunk or crippled, and the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific was in chaos. At 9/11, Admiral Kurita did something that would haunt Japanese naval officers for the rest of their lives. He ordered a general retreat. He turned Yamato and the entire center force around and withdrew back through San Bernardino Strait. Japanese staff officers on Yamato's bridge argued with him. They pointed out that the American carriers were still within range, that the escort was crippled, that victory was in front of them. Kurita refused. He later explained that the ferocity of the American attacks, the constant torpedo threats from every direction, the air attacks that never seemed to stop, all of it convinced him he was fighting a major fleet action against American fast battleships and heavy carriers. He could not accept that 7 small ships had held him off. The total American cost was staggering. USS Howell sunk. USS Johnston sunk. Commander Evans going down with his ship, still giving orders as water closed over his bridge. USS Samuel B. Roberts sunk. Escort carrier USS Gambier Bay sunk. Escort carrier USS St. Lo sunk by the first organized kamikaze attack in history. Over 1,100 American sailors killed. But 200,000 American soldiers on the Leyte beaches were never touched. The transports were never attacked. The invasion continued. Every torpedo Gibbs had insisted on, every extra tube the admirals had called wasteful, had helped turn back the most powerful Japanese surface fleet of the war. Commander Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Taffy III received the Presidential Unit Citation, the first and only time an entire unit of escort carriers and destroyers received such recognition. Japanese post-war analysts concluded that the battle off Samar was the moment the Imperial Japanese Navy lost the Pacific War, not just materially, but psychologically. They had sent their most powerful fleet against their weakest American target and been driven off by destroyers. News of Samar reached Washington within 48 hours. War correspondents filed stories about the charge of the tin can sailors. Admiral Nimitz ordered every destroyer squadron commander in the Pacific to study the battle. Production of Fletcher-Class destroyers accelerated again. By December 1944, 14 new hulls were being launched per month. Training programs doubled, and Japanese naval doctrine collapsed. Captured documents later showed that after Samar, Japanese commanders were ordered to avoid surface engagements with American destroyer groups whenever possible, and to prioritize kamikaze attacks against them instead. The ship designer, who had been called obstructive, institutionally deaf, and a bookkeeper, had just redefined what a destroyer could do. From a cramped Washington office to the greatest destroyer action in naval history. Gibbs's idea had traveled a path no one predicted. But here's the question nobody was asking as the celebrations began. What happened to Commander William Austin Gibbs? While Ernest Evans received the Medal of Honor and the crews of Taffy III became legends, where was the quiet engineer whose stubborn design had made all of it possible? While newspapers printed photographs of destroyer captains and fleet admirals who was sitting alone in the Bureau of Ships late at night, reading the after-action reports by lamplight. The story of the Fletcher-class does not end at Samar. It does not end with Japan's surrender. It does not even end in the 20th century. The ships Gibbs designed would fight in Korea, in Vietnam, in oceans he had never sailed under flags he had never saluted. And the man himself, the one who started everything, would live out his final years in a way that almost nobody knows about. This story has one final chapter, and it is the chapter that changes everything. In parts 1, 2, and 3, we watched Commander William Austin Gibbs fight the Navy's bureaucracy to build a destroyer carrying 10 torpedoes per ship. We saw 6 Fletcher-class warships annihilate 3 Japanese destroyers at Vela Gulf. We witnessed Commander Ernest Evans charge USS Johnston directly at the super battleship Yamato, and helped turn back the most powerful Japanese fleet of the war at Samar. A design admirals had called ridiculous had just rewritten naval history. But the question we ended part 3 with is the one that has haunted this story from the beginning. What happened to the man who started it all? Because this story has a twist nobody expected. A final chapter buried in classified files for 59 years, a fate that almost no naval historian has ever properly told. And it reveals something uncomfortable about how history remembers its heroes. Because success, it turns out, sometimes comes at a price that nobody ever talks about. When Japan signed the surrender documents on the deck of USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, Commander William Austin Gibbs was 51 years old, sitting at his desk in the main Navy building in Washington. He was reviewing production schedules for ships that would never be built. His hair had gone gray during the war. His hands shook slightly from too many years of bad coffee and too little sleep. While sailors danced in Times Square and kissed strangers on VJ Day, Gibbs finished his paperwork, locked his office, and took the bus home to his modest apartment in Arlington, where Helen had kept dinner warm. No photographer from Life magazine was waiting for him. No ticker-tape parade. The man who designed the most important destroyer class of the 20th century went home on a city bus. And here is what makes this part of the story so painful. When the Navy distributed its wartime commendations in early 1946, the system's priorities became brutally clear. Combat commanders received medals. Shipyard workers received presidential citations. Evans received the Medal of Honor. Gibbs received a Legion of Merit. The citation praised his meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services, language so generic it could have applied to any staff officer who kept his filing cabinet organized. The word Fletcher did not appear in his commendation. Not once. Again, Gibbs never complained publicly. Those who knew him said he was not that kind of man. He measured his own success in displacement tonnages, not ribbons. But privately, in letters discovered decades later in the Naval History Archives, he expressed a quiet bitterness. In one 1947 letter to a retired colleague, he wrote that the Bureau of Ships was a place where good ideas go to be adopted by someone with more stars on his collar. He did not need to name names. Several admirals who had opposed the Fletcher design in 1940 would later take public credit for championing it, their earlier opposition conveniently forgotten. Gibbs remained in the Navy until 1948, retiring at the rank of captain, one grade above his wartime rank. He settled in Norfolk, Virginia, took a small consulting job designing commercial fishing vessels, and spent his remaining years drawing harbor tugs and crab boats on a drafting table in his home basement. He died in 1961, at age 67, of a heart attack while working on blueprints for a shrimp trawler. His obituary in the Norfolk Virginian Pilot was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his Navy service. It did not mention the Fletcher-Class. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, but his headstone bears only his name rank and dates of service. No mention of 175 ships. No mention of Samar. No mention of the thousands of lives his stubborn engineering had saved. The man who designed the weapon never got to wield it, and when the weapon won the war, almost no one remembered his name. But his ships, his real legacy, outlived him by half a century. Because here is what almost nobody knows. The Fletcher-Class did not retire when World War II ended. It kept fighting. When North Korean forces invaded the South on June 25, 1950, Fletcher-Class destroyers were among the first American warships to respond. They pounded North Korean supply lines with their 5-inch guns during the defense of the Pusan perimeter. They led the way through treacherous 30-foot tides at the Incheon landing. They provided covering fire during the desperate Hungnam evacuation, where over 100,000 troops and 91,000 Korean civilians were rescued from the Chinese advance. In Vietnam, Fletcher served on the naval gun line supporting Marines and Army units fighting ashore. The lead ship, USS Fletcher herself, was not decommissioned until 1969, 28 years after her keel was laid. Other Fletchers served even longer in foreign navies. The Greek Navy operated them until 1993. The Mexican Navy kept theirs until 2001. Brazil retired its last Fletcher in 1992. Turkey, Italy, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Colombia, Chile, Peru, Argentina, Spain, and Taiwan. All operated Fletcher-Class destroyers at various points during the Cold War. Over 30 nations sailed them. The total numbers are staggering. 175 hulls built over 50 years of combined service across 30-plus navies, participation in virtually every major American naval operation from Guadalcanal in 1942 to Vietnam in 1969. An estimated 15,000 sailors served aboard them during World War II alone. After the war, tens of thousands more crewed them across every ocean on Earth. Naval architects today still study Gibbs's hull form as a masterclass in balancing competing design requirements. The larger, better balanced hull that the General Board had called bloated in 1940 became the foundation for every American destroyer designed for the next 20 years. But the greatest legacy of the Fletcher class is not measured in tonnage sea miles or years of service. It is measured in a principle that extends far beyond naval architecture, because every major military innovation in history has followed the same pattern. An outsider sees a problem that insiders have accepted as unsolvable. The outsider proposes a solution that the establishment rejects as impossible. The outsider persists against institutional resistance, often at great personal cost, and eventually reality forces the institution to accept what it should have embraced from the beginning. Billy Mitchell argued that aircraft could sink battleships. The Army court-martialed him. 5 years later, every Navy on Earth was building aircraft carriers. Percy Hobart designed specialized armored vehicles for D-Day. His own army forced him into retirement. His funny tanks later saved thousands of lives on the Normandy beaches. Barnes Wallis proposed a bouncing bomb to destroy German dams. The Air Ministry told him it was fantasy. Operation Chastise proved them catastrophically wrong. Gibbs belongs in this lineage, not because his innovation was the most dramatic, but because his story illustrates something the more famous examples sometimes obscure. Innovation is not about the moment of genius. It is about the long, grinding, unglamorous fight to turn an idea into reality against the resistance of people who have every institutional reason to say no. Gibbs spent years in windowless offices arguing with committees, revising calculations, defending specifications. That is not the stuff of Hollywood movies, but it is the stuff that wins wars. The lesson applies far beyond military history. Every organization develops institutional antibodies that attack new ideas. The larger the organization, the stronger those antibodies become. The Navy of 1940 was not filled with stupid men. It was filled with intelligent, experienced officers who had legitimate reasons for skepticism. Gibbs did not succeed because he was smarter than everyone else. He succeeded because he was willing to do the work nobody else wanted to do. And here is the detail that almost nobody knows: the twist that was buried in classified files for 59 years before the National Archives finally declassified them in 2003. In September 1944, 1 month before the Battle of Vela Gulf, Gibbs submitted a proposal to the Bureau of Ships for an improved destroyer design. Designation SCB-85. It incorporated every lesson the Fletcher class had taught during 2 years of brutal combat. 10 torpedoes, same as before. But now, a twin 5-inch gun mount forward, increasing gunfire power by 40%. While actually reducing top weight through a new lightweight mount. An integrated combat information center designed from the keel up. Improved damage control based on analysis of every Fletcher loss from Guadalcanal onward. Gibbs calculated the new design could absorb 30% more damage than a standard Fletcher before losing combat capability. The Bureau rejected SCB-85 in November 1944. The official reason was production schedule disruption. The real reason, revealed in the declassified correspondence, was that several senior officers felt Gibbs had overstepped his authority by submitting the proposal directly to the Chief of Bureau, rather than through his immediate supervisor. One internal memo described him as technically brilliant, but institutionally deaf. The proposal was shelved. 5 years later, when the Navy designed the Fletcher-Class Destroyer of 1949, The design team independently arrived at many of the same solutions Gibbs had proposed in SCB-85. They did not credit him. They may not have even known his proposal existed. His classified file sat in a warehouse in Suitland, Maryland for 59 years before a naval historian stumbled across it while researching an unrelated topic. Gibbs never knew his final design had been vindicated. He died in 1961, 8 years before his own files were properly catalogued. The man had been right one last time, and nobody ever told him. From a quiet engineer's drafting table in Washington to 175 steel hulls that fought across every ocean on Earth. From blueprints dismissed as ridiculous in 1940 to the design that helped save 200,000 American soldiers at Samar in 1944. From 4 dismissive sentences in a small-town obituary to a combat legacy spanning 50 years and 30 navies. Commander William Austin Gibbs proved that the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal is not a torpedo, a gun, or a bomb. It is an idea that the right person refuses to abandon. Japan built the largest battleship in human history. America built 175 destroyers that made it irrelevant. That is the difference between spectacle and strategy. That is the difference between an empire that builds monuments to itself and a nation that builds tools to solve problems. If you know another story of a forgotten innovator whose crazy idea changed history, a nurse, a farmer, a welder, a mechanic whose name never made the history books, share it in the comments below. The Second World War produced hundreds of these stories, men and women whose inventions shaped the modern world while their names disappeared. Subscribe for more of them. Because the next time someone tells you your idea is insane, remember Commander Gibbs. Remember the Fletcher-Class. Remember that every ship that changed the world was once just a drawing on a desk that nobody believed in. And remember this: the loudest voices in the room are almost never the ones building the future. The future is built quietly in cramped offices by stubborn people with calculations and coffee and the refusal to give up. Gibbs never saw his name on a warship. He never got his parade. But 175 hulls sailed under his design across 5 decades of history, and every sailor who came home alive because of them was his monument. That is his legacy. That is the real story. And that, more than any metal ever cast, is what it means to change the world. Then